The grand concert hall was glowing that evening. Bright lights reflected on the polished floor, and the soft hum of conversations filled the air. People in elegant clothes took their seats, holding programs that had one name written in bold letters, the name of the world-famous pianist everyone had come to see. He was known for his flawless performances, his technical perfection, and his confidence that sometimes felt too sharp to be polite. He had performed in the greatest cities of the world, and tonight, he was back in his home country for a charity concert. The audience whispered about him with admiration, waiting for the moment he would walk out and touch the piano keys. The air carried a kind of electricity that only live music can create. Among the hundreds of people sitting in that grand hall was a woman who seemed very different from the rest. She sat quietly in one of the back rows, her plain dress slightly wrinkled, her hair tied in a simple bun. She didn't have jewelry or fancy clothes like others around her, but her eyes shone with a warmth that seemed to notice everything. The way the pianist's name glowed on the banner, the shine of the grand piano under the spotlight, the murmurs of excitement spreading through the hall. She held a small cloth bag on her lap, clutching it as if it carried something precious. When the lights dimmed, a hush fell over the crowd. Then came the moment. The pianist stepped onto the stage. The applause was thunderous. He gave a polite smile, bowed slightly, and sat down at the piano with practiced grace. His fingers rested lightly on the keys for just a second before the first note filled the room. The music that followed was magnificent, powerful, sharp, and controlled. Each note landed perfectly, like it had been calculated in advance. The audience was mesmerized, their eyes following every movement of his hands. The pianist's head swayed slightly as he played, and his face showed pride in every rhythm. For over an hour, he performed piece after piece, and every time he finished, the crowd rose in admiration. When the final note echoed and faded, he stood up, soaking in the applause that seemed endless. He loved this part. The praise, the admiration, the cameras flashing from every corner. After all, this was his world. As the audience began to leave their seats during the short break, some moved forward to greet him or take photos. That was when the woman from the back row slowly made her way toward the stage. She waited patiently as people surrounded him, complimenting his performance and asking for autographs. When the crowd around him started to thin out, she finally stepped closer. Her voice was soft but clear. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Would it be all right if I played something? Just for a minute." The pianist turned toward her, his eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise. Around them, a few people overheard her request and began to whisper. Some chuckled quietly, others simply stared. She didn't look like a musician. Her clothes were plain, her shoes slightly worn. She didn't carry herself with the air of someone who belonged on a stage. The pianist blinked, then gave a small, amused smile. "You want to play?" he asked, his tone light but edged with disbelief. She nodded slowly. "Just for a moment," she said again, her hands nervously holding her small bag. A short laugh escaped his lips, not loud but enough to make a few people around him smirk. He wasn't trying to be cruel, but the idea seemed ridiculous to him. A woman who looked like she came from an ordinary life, asking to play on a piano worth more than most people's homes. It sounded like a joke. "Well," he said finally, stepping aside, "why not? Let's hear what you've got." His voice carried a hint of teasing, but he gestured toward the piano like a showman. A few people near the front rows sat back down, curious to see what would happen. Some took out their phones thinking it might be funny to record. The hall was quieter now, just the sound of the woman's slow footsteps as she approached the piano. She placed her bag carefully on the floor beside the bench and sat down. For a second, she just stared at the keys, her hands hovering uncertainly above them. The crowd waited, some hiding smiles. The pianist crossed his arms, watching with the kind of grin that said he already knew how this would end. But as the seconds passed, something about her changed. Her breathing steadied, her back straightened, and her fingers lowered gently onto the keys. The room was so quiet that even the sound of her first soft note seemed louder than it really was. No one laughed now. She played a few more notes. Slow, tender, delicate. It was nothing like the pianist's grand performance earlier. Her melody was simple, but it carried warmth like a quiet story told by someone who had lived it deeply. The sound seemed to come from somewhere beyond skill. It came from emotion, from memory. The pianist's grin slowly faded. He tilted his head slightly, his arms dropping to his sides as he listened. There was something in her playing that made the air in the hall feel different, heavier, more human. Every key she touched seemed to breathe life. The crowd sat still, unsure how to react. The woman's eyes were half closed, and a small smile touched her lips as her hands moved gently, gracefully. The piano, which had earlier sounded like a weapon in the pianist's control, now sounded like a voice telling a story, soft, aching, and beautiful. A few people in the front row exchanged glances, their smiles gone. One person whispered, "She's good," under their breath. Another just stared, lost in the tune. The pianist himself didn't move. He felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years, a kind of humility. He realized that while he had mastered the technique, he had forgotten the soul. After a few minutes, the woman stopped. Her fingers rested on the keys for a moment longer before she pulled them back. She stood up quietly and looked at the pianist. "Thank you," she said softly, as if she'd just borrowed something sacred. The audience didn't clap immediately. It was like they were too caught up in the moment to remember how. Then, slowly, a sound began, a single clap, then another, until the hall filled with applause again. But this time it wasn't loud or wild. It was gentle, filled with genuine respect. The pianist blinked, his throat tightening as he tried to find words. "That was beautiful," he finally said, his voice lower now, humbled. The woman smiled faintly and nodded. "Music speaks when words can't," she replied softly. And before he could say anything else, she picked up her little bag, turned around, and began to walk away. She didn't seem to notice the crowd watching her. She just walked slowly toward the exit, her footsteps calm and unhurried. The pianist stood there for a long time, staring at the piano she had just played. The same instrument he had spent his life mastering suddenly felt new, as if it held secrets he had never discovered. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from. But in just a few minutes she had managed to show him something that years of fame and applause never had. That night, after the show ended and everyone had gone, the pianist stayed behind. The hall was quiet, the lights dimmed. He sat down again at the piano, his fingers resting on the same keys she had touched. He tried to play, but the notes sounded empty. So he stopped, sat in silence, and smiled to himself. For the first time in years, he realized he still had something to learn. Outside the concert hall, the simple woman walked into the cool night air. She looked up at the stars, her eyes soft but heavy with memories. The music she had played wasn't just a tune. It was a piece of her heart she had left behind on those keys. And though no one knew her story yet, the pianist would soon make sure the world did. The hall was almost empty now. The lights dimmed, leaving only the faint glow from the stage. The pianist sat alone at the grand piano, the same one the simple woman had played just an hour earlier. He ran his fingers slowly over the keys but didn't press them. Something about the silence felt louder than any sound he could make. He thought about her, that quiet woman with kind eyes and trembling hands. The way she had walked up to him, so calm yet unsure. The way the audience had laughed softly. And then how she silenced them all with just one melody. He couldn't shake off the feeling her music left inside him. It wasn't about perfection or power. It was something deeper, something real. For years he had played for applause. Every note he hit was meant to impress, to prove something. To the audience, to the critics, maybe even to himself. But that night, while she played, he realized that her music didn't need to prove anything. It just spoke, and that was what made it beautiful. The next morning, he couldn't focus on anything else. Even as he sat in his hotel suite, the tune she had played echoed in his mind. It wasn't a complicated melody, but it carried a strange weight, gentle like a whisper, yet strong enough to stay with him. He found himself humming it without realizing. He tried to replay it on the piano, but no matter how hard he tried, it didn't sound the same. There was something in her touch that couldn't be copied. He decided to find her. He asked the concert organizers if anyone knew who she was, but no one did. She hadn't left her name, hadn't spoken to anyone afterward. Some staff members remembered seeing her walk out quietly, but that was all. Days passed, and the memory of her music only grew stronger. During interviews, he caught himself drifting off, thinking about that soft melody that had changed everything. Reporters noticed he seemed different, less proud, more thoughtful. When one journalist asked if anything unusual had happened during the concert, he smiled faintly and said, "Someone reminded me what music really means." That small sentence became a headline the next day, and people started asking questions. Who was he talking about? Who had inspired him so deeply? Meanwhile, in a small part of the same city, the woman lived a quiet life. She worked at a local shop during the day, arranging shelves and helping customers. Her coworkers knew her as kind but quiet, someone who always smiled but rarely talked about her past. She never mentioned the concert. It was like it had been just another moment in her long, ordinary life. But every night after work, she sat by a small piano in her living room, an old one, its paint slightly chipped and its sound a little uneven. She played softly, closing her eyes as her fingers danced over the worn keys. The music filled her small home, wrapping it in memories of someone she had loved dearly. The tune she played that night at the concert wasn't chosen randomly. It was a song she used to play years ago for her little boy. When he was sick and couldn't sleep, she would sit beside him and play that same melody until his breathing slowed and his eyes closed. It was his favorite, but when he passed away, she stopped playing altogether. For years, the piano had stood in the corner, covered with a sheet gathering dust. She couldn't bear to touch it. Every time she walked past, her heart would ache with memories she tried to bury. Then one day she had seen the poster for the concert, the famous pianist performing for charity. She didn't even know why she bought the ticket. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper calling her. She had sat in that hall surrounded by strangers, listening to the powerful music that felt perfect but empty to her. And when the pianist finished, she had felt something stir inside. It wasn't courage exactly, but more like a quiet voice whispering, "Play again." She hadn't planned to walk up to him, but something inside her pushed her forward, and before she knew it, she was standing by the stage asking to play. Now, sitting at home, she smiled softly at the memory. She hadn't expected anyone to listen. She just wanted to feel the keys again, even for a few minutes. But seeing the way the audience reacted, and the way the pianist had looked at her afterward, it felt like she had given life to something that had been sleeping inside her for years. Back in the city center, the pianist still couldn't forget her. He felt like he had to see her again, not for fame, not for curiosity, but to understand. He asked his assistant to check the concert's security footage. After hours of searching, they found a short clip of her walking toward the piano. From that, they managed to trace her ticket purchase and find her name and address. A few days later, he went to meet her. When she opened the door, she looked surprised. The man standing there was wearing a simple coat and a shy smile, very different from the confident performer she had seen on stage. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said softly. "I just wanted to thank you for the other night." She looked unsure for a moment, then smiled gently and invited him in. Her home was small but warm, filled with little signs of care, fresh flowers in a vase, books neatly arranged on a shelf, and the old piano sitting near the window. He walked toward it slowly. "You still play," he said. "Sometimes," she replied. "Not much." He sat on a chair nearby, watching her. "The song you played," he asked quietly, "where did it come from?" Her hands folded in her lap. For a few seconds, she didn't speak. Then she said, "It was my son's favorite. I used to play it for him every night." Her voice softened as she continued. "When he got sick, music was the only thing that made him smile. After he was gone, I stopped. I thought I'd never play again." The pianist didn't speak. He just listened. He could see the emotion behind every word, the kind that doesn't need fancy language to move you. She looked at the piano again and said, "That night, when I heard you play, something woke up inside me. I realized I'd buried that part of myself for too long. I didn't plan to ask to play. I just did." He nodded slowly. "You reminded me of something I'd forgotten too," he said quietly. "That music isn't about perfection. It's about feeling. I haven't stopped thinking about your song since that night." She looked surprised. "Really?" He smiled faintly. "Yes, and I'd like to ask something," he said. "Would you play it again?" Just once she hesitated, then nodded. Sitting down at her old piano, she began to play the same gentle melody. The room filled with the sound, soft, real, full of life. The pianist closed his eyes and listened. It wasn't just a song. It was a memory, a story, a piece of love that had survived loss. When she finished, the silence that followed felt peaceful, not empty. He opened his eyes and said quietly, "You should share this with others." She smiled and shook her head. "I'm just an ordinary woman. No one would care." He looked at her with warmth. "That's where you're wrong. People need to hear music like this, music that comes from the heart." She didn't answer, but her eyes glistened. Before he left, he turned at the door and said softly, "Would you ever consider performing again?" "With me?" Her eyes widened. "Me? I'm not a performer." "You're more of one than you think," he said, smiling. "Think about it." When he left, she stood by the window watching him walk away. A quiet smile touched her face. For the first time in years, she felt something inside her heal. That night, the pianist sat in his hotel room again, but this time, the melody didn't haunt him. It guided him. He began to write a new piece inspired by her song, by her story. And as he played the first few notes, he knew this was only the beginning of something beautiful. The day of the second performance arrived quietly, without the fanfare of the first concert. This time it wasn't about fame or glitz. The pianist had invited her to play alongside him in a small local hall. The chairs were simple, the stage modest, and the crowd much smaller, but the atmosphere felt heavier, more intimate. The audience didn't know much about the woman. Most of them had come to see the famous pianist, curious about the small story of the mysterious woman who had played before. She walked in quietly, carrying herself with a mixture of nervousness and calm. She wasn't dressed for a grand performance, just a simple dress and shoes she had worn many times before. But the pianist gave her a reassuring nod from the stage, and she felt a strange confidence swell inside her. She wasn't here to impress anyone with skill or speed. She was here to play from the heart, just as she always had. When the lights dimmed and the pianist began the first notes of his introduction, she took her place beside him. She could feel her fingers hovering over the keys of her piano, waiting for the moment when she could speak through them. The first chord she struck was soft and hesitant, just like the first day she had touched a piano after years of silence. Then slowly her fingers moved with a certainty she hadn't felt before. Each note came naturally, gently, like water flowing over stones. The audience leaned forward in their seats. They had expected a simple accompaniment at best, maybe a small contribution that would be overshadowed by the main performance. But as the woman's melody blended with the pianist's, it created something unexpected, something that could not be planned, rehearsed, or predicted. It was alive. She wasn't trying to show skill. She didn't rush, didn't play flashy notes, didn't try to impress. She played the melody that had been buried in her heart for so long, the song that had once soothed her child and now soothed her own soul. Each note carried a memory, a piece of love, a touch of loss, and the hall seemed to listen in silence. Some people's eyes began to glisten. One man sitting near the front held his hand over his chest as though her music had reached right into his heart. A woman in the back wiped a tear quietly, not daring to make a sound. The pianist noticed the change in the room. He had played in countless halls filled with applause, standing ovations, and critical reviews. But he had never felt the quiet, steady pull of emotion that this melody was creating. He watched her hands move over the keys, delicate and sure. He saw the slight tremor when she reached for higher notes, the pause when she remembered a passage from the past, and the gentle way she pressed each key with meaning. Her music wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. It was honest, raw, and simple, and in its simplicity it was profound. When the song reached its peak, the audience was holding its breath. Every ear strained, every heart quiet, every eye fixed on the woman who had seemed ordinary the day before. But now she was extraordinary. She was a storyteller, a healer, a guide who could make people feel something they had forgotten. And she didn't need a grand piano, fancy clothes, or recognition to do it. The pianist's own playing changed as he followed her lead. His fingers moved more gently, his notes more thoughtful. He realized he had been playing for applause all these years, not for meaning. And now, sitting beside her, listening and responding, he felt what music was supposed to be: a conversation, a bridge, a connection. The melody ended softly, the last note hanging in the air as if the room itself didn't want to let it go. Silence followed for a few seconds, and then the applause began. But it wasn't the polite, expected applause of a concert hall. It was honest, deep, and full of emotion. People clapped slowly, letting each beat sink in. Some wiped their eyes, some hugged each other quietly, and some just sat frozen, unsure if they could speak yet. The woman looked at the pianist, and for the first time, She allowed herself a small, shy smile. She had expected nerves, maybe a few polite nods, but she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to touch hearts that she didn't even know existed. After the performance, people approached them quietly, speaking in hushed, awed voices. One woman said, "I haven't felt that in years." "Thank you," a man whispered. "Your music. It reminded me of my mother." Others didn't say a word but just shook their heads slowly, their faces showing gratitude and surprise. The pianist watched her. He could feel his chest tightening with something he hadn't experienced in years: humility. He realized that fame, applause, and technical skill were not the same as touching someone's heart. And she, the simple woman who had walked in quietly, had done it effortlessly. Later, when the crowd had thinned, he turned to her. "You don't know what you did tonight," he said softly. "You've reminded everyone, including me, what music really is." She shook her head gently. "I'm not a professional," she said. "I just played what I remembered." "No," he said firmly. "You played more than a song. You told a story. You gave us a part of yourself, and that is more important than any concert I've ever played." For the first time, she didn't feel shy. She realized that music had a power she hadn't believed it still held. It could heal, it could move, it could connect strangers, and she had found her place in it again. The pianist invited her to join him again for another performance in the coming months, a larger concert with more people. She hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to step back into a world she had left behind, but she felt a quiet strength inside her, a reminder that the music had never left her. In the days that followed, the story of her performance spread quietly through the community. People who had attended told friends and family. Some described it as the most emotional thing I've ever heard. Others said, "I didn't expect her to play, and yet she stole the show." The pianist, usually the center of attention, now found himself being asked about her, about the woman who had played from her heart. But the woman didn't seek recognition. She returned to her life, working in her small shop, helping her neighbors, quietly playing her piano when no one was watching. Yet she knew that something inside her had changed. She had found a voice she thought she had lost. And for the first time, she realized that music wasn't about proving anything. It was about feeling, about sharing, and about living. One evening, after returning from another rehearsal with the pianist, she sat by her window and watched the sunset. The city lights began to twinkle below, and she could still hear the echoes of the melody she had played. She realized that her music had given people hope, comfort, and something to remember. And in doing so, it had also given her back a part of herself that she thought was gone forever. Meanwhile, the pianist was reflecting on the same evening from his own home. He had spent years playing, traveling, and winning praise, but he had never felt anything like this. Watching her, listening to her, and learning from her had changed his approach to music completely. He began practicing differently, focusing not on speed or technique, but on depth, emotion, and the story behind every note. He felt inspired, renewed, and humble. They didn't need grand stages or bright lights to play. They didn't need accolades or fame. For them, the music had found its meaning again, in emotion, in honesty, and in the quiet moments shared between two people who understood it. The day ended with both of them quietly smiling to themselves. One had rediscovered her voice, and the other had rediscovered the soul of music. Together they had begun a journey that neither of them had expected, one that would touch many more hearts in the days to come. And so, in that small hall, surrounded by ordinary people, the simple woman and the famous pianist had created something extraordinary, a reminder that true music is not in perfection or applause, but in feeling, in truth, and in the courage to share a piece of your soul with the world. After the second performance, the pianist couldn't stop thinking about her. He had played in countless halls in front of thousands, yet nothing had ever moved him as deeply as her music did. He knew there was more behind the melody than anyone had heard. It wasn't just a song, it was a story, a life lived in quiet moments, a history of love and loss that shaped each note. He decided to visit her again, hoping she would allow him to understand more about the music she carried in her hands. When he arrived at her small home, he noticed how peaceful it looked. There was nothing extravagant, no traces of wealth or fame, just simple furniture neatly arranged and the old piano standing silently in the corner. He could see that this piano was not just an instrument, it was a repository of memories. When she opened the door, she greeted him with a warm smile, though a hint of surprise showed in her eyes. "I didn't expect you again," she said softly. "I couldn't stop thinking about your music," he admitted. "There's something I need to understand. The way you play. It's unlike anything I've ever heard. It's not technique. It's something else. Something real."
"Can you tell me?"
She hesitated. For a moment it seemed like she might brush it off, say it wasn't important, but then slowly she invited him inside. The room smelled faintly of flowers and old wood, comforting and familiar. She gestured to the piano. "Sit," she said. "I'll tell you." She began by speaking of her past softly, almost as if speaking louder would shatter the memories. She told him about her son, a small boy who loved music more than anything. Even when he was sick, he would hum tunes and clap along, his tiny hands moving as though he could keep time with the world. She remembered the first time he touched the keys, his small fingers stumbling over notes but smiling with pride. Music had been their connection, a way to speak without words, to comfort each other in sickness and in joy. He loved it, she said quietly. Every night I would play the same song for him until he fell asleep. I thought that melody could keep him safe, even if only for a little while. The pianist listened closely, feeling a lump in his throat. He had performed in grand halls, under bright lights with cameras flashing, yet nothing in his experience prepared him for the weight and depth of this story. He realized her music was not just skill, it was love. Every note she had played in the concert hall carried the memory of her son, of those quiet nights when music was their world. When he asked how she could play with such emotion, she explained, it wasn't about practice or talent. It was about memory, about feeling. When I play, I remember him. I feel everything he gave me, everything I lost. And somehow the music speaks that feeling. He thought of the night she had first played in the hall. The audience had laughed at first, expecting a clumsy, ordinary performance. But then, as she played, something invisible moved through the hall. Every person had felt it, even those who didn't know her story. The pianist now understood why. The music wasn't just notes. It was life itself distilled into sound. For a while they sat in silence. He watched her fingers gently trace over the keys of her old piano. There was a tenderness in the way she touched each one, a reverence that told him she understood the power of every note. It wasn't showmanship. It was devotion. Then, slowly, she played again. The melody was the same one she had played at the concert, yet it sounded even more intimate now, filled with the weight of her memories. The pianist closed his eyes, letting the notes wash over him. He could feel the boy who had once slept to this tune, the love that had shaped it and the grief that had tried to bury it. He felt the depth of human experience carried in her hands. When the final note faded, the silence in the room was profound. He finally spoke. "Your music, it's not just beautiful, it's sacred. It carries a story that touches everyone who hears it. I've played thousands of pieces in my life, but nothing has ever moved me this way." She looked down, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. "I never thought anyone would hear it like this," she said softly. "I thought it was just my memory, my grief. I didn't know it could mean something to others." "You've given people hope," he said. "Even those who don't know your story feel it. You've reminded all of us, that music is about life, not perfection, about connection, not applause." For the first time, she allowed herself to smile fully, without hesitation or doubt. "I didn't know I still had this inside me," she admitted. "I thought it was gone with him." The pianist reached over and lightly touched her hand. "It wasn't gone," he said. "It was waiting for the right moment. And now you've shared it with the world. You've changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone who hears your music." They spoke for hours, and as the evening turned to night, the pianist asked if she would consider performing again, not out of necessity, not for fame, but to continue sharing her gift with those who needed it most. She hesitated, thinking about the quiet life she had built, the ordinary routine she had come to rely on. Yet deep down she knew this was more than a choice, and it was a calling. "I'll do it," she said finally. "But only if it feels right. Only if it comes from the heart." The pianist smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "That's all anyone could ever ask," he said. The next few days were filled with preparation. She practiced gently, allowing the memories to guide her fingers. He guided her when she needed support, not instruction, teaching her how to feel the music in a way that could reach even more people. They became partners not in fame but in purpose, two musicians connected by heart rather than skill. Word of their collaboration spread quietly at first. People who had attended the previous performances shared their experiences, speaking of the simple woman who could touch souls through music. The pianist found that for the first time, people were excited not just for him but for her story, her music, her presence. When the day of the next concert arrived, the woman felt a mixture of fear and hope. She remembered her son, the nights they had shared, the quiet songs that had comforted him. She felt his memory in her hands as she touched the piano, letting the music flow naturally, without effort or expectation. The audience waited with anticipation, curious about the mysterious woman who had already touched the pianist so deeply. The moment she began to play, the room changed. People leaned forward, their eyes softening, their hearts opening. Her music carried them beyond the hall, beyond time and place, into a world of emotion and connection. Tears flowed quietly in the front rows, and a few people hugged themselves as though holding on to the feelings she stirred. The pianist sat beside her, playing gently, but he knew that this night belonged to her. She led the music with her heart, and he followed, learning once again what it meant to feel, to connect, to be human. When the final note lingered and faded, the applause was long and heartfelt. People stood not out of obligation, but because they had been touched, moved, and transformed. The woman looked at the pianist, her eyes bright with emotion. She had shared her story without words, and now everyone in the hall knew it, felt it, in the music she had played. Afterward, the pianist said quietly, "You've shown me everything I forgot. You've reminded the world what music really is." She shook her head softly. "I didn't think I could do it. But now I know. Music can heal if we let it." That night they left the hall together, walking quietly under the city lights. Both of them knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more concerts, more performances, more opportunities to share what they had discovered together. But more importantly, they had learned something that could never be measured in applause or awards. They had learned the power of music to touch the soul, to tell stories words could not, and to connect people in ways nothing else could. The day of the final concert arrived, bigger than the previous ones. This time the hall was filled to capacity. People came not just for the famous pianist, but to see the woman who had captured hearts with her music. Word had spread about the simple woman whose melodies could move people to tears, whose playing was filled with emotion that reached beyond technical skill. Everyone was curious, excited, and a little unsure of what to expect. She arrived early, carrying only herself and a quiet confidence she had never felt before. The pianist greeted her with a warm smile, a silent understanding passing between them. They didn't need to talk much. Their music had already formed a bond stronger than words. Backstage, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Musicians tuned their instruments, stagehands checked lights, and reporters murmured quietly. The woman stood by the piano, taking deep breaths, feeling the familiar weight of memories she carried in her fingers. This wasn't just another performance. This was a chance to share a piece of her life, a story that had been living in her heart for years. When the lights dimmed and the audience fell silent, the pianist began to play the first notes, delicate and careful. She followed, her hands moving naturally over the keys. The hall was filled with the blend of their music, soft yet powerful, simple yet profound. Every note she played carried a memory, a feeling, a piece of love and loss. The audience was captivated. People leaned forward, listening intently. Some had tears in their eyes. Others simply closed their eyes to let the music wash over them. Every corner of the hall felt the emotion, the honesty in each note, the life behind the melody. The pianist watched her hands, but more than that, he watched her soul reflected in every movement. He realized again that this was what music was truly about: connection, emotion, and the courage to share what is most personal. As the performance continued, her confidence grew. Each note was a conversation with the audience, each pause a breath of emotion that carried meaning. She wasn't performing to impress or to show skill. She was telling a story, and the people listening could feel every word she didn't speak. The pianist played alongside her, adjusting, listening, responding. Together they created a harmony that neither could have achieved alone. The music flowed like water, gentle yet unstoppable, weaving stories of love, loss, hope, and healing. It was more than a performance. It was an experience, a gift, a reminder of what it meant to be human. When she reached the climax of the melody, a quiet hush fell over the audience. Some clutched their hands to their chests, feeling emotions they had buried for years. The music seemed to stretch beyond the hall, touching hearts and minds in ways that no one could describe with words. It was living, breathing, and completely alive. Finally, the last note lingered and faded. The hall stayed silent for a heartbeat, as if holding its breath before applause erupted. But it wasn't just polite clapping, it was heartfelt, powerful, and unstoppable. People rose to their feet, some crying, some hugging one another, some standing in awe of what they had just experienced. The woman sat back, letting her hands rest on the keys. She felt a wave of emotion herself, knowing she had shared a part of her life that had once been locked away. She looked at the pianist and, for the first time, allowed herself to fully feel the connection they had built. This was more than music. This was healing. After the applause settled, the pianist turned to her, his voice soft but full of respect. "You've done something extraordinary," he said. "Not just for me or the audience, but for yourself. You've shared what was hidden, and it has changed everyone who listened." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "I never thought I could," she admitted. "I thought my music belonged only to memories, but now it belongs to all of us." The concert became the talk of the city. Reporters wrote articles not just about the famous pianist, but about her story, her courage, and the music that came from a heart full of love and loss. People shared their experiences online, describing how her playing had touched them, reminded them of someone they loved, or helped them face emotions they had long ignored. For the pianist, the experience changed him profoundly. He began to approach his music differently, no longer focused solely on technical skill or recognition. He played to feel, to connect, to share something real. Every performance became an opportunity to speak, to move, to create meaning. He credited the woman openly, telling interviewers that she had reminded him what music was truly for, to touch the soul, not just the ears. The woman, meanwhile, returned to her quiet life, but she no longer felt ordinary. She had discovered a voice that was uniquely hers, a power she had once thought lost. She continued to play, sometimes for audiences, sometimes for herself, but always with the same honesty and emotion. People came to hear her, not because she was famous, but because they wanted to feel the life and love embedded in her music. Over time, the pianist and the woman performed together several more times. Each concert was different, yet the same in essence, a sharing of stories through music, a blending of souls, a reminder that real art comes from the heart. They didn't compete and they didn't try to outshine each other. They listened. They responded. They created something bigger than either could alone. In interviews, the pianist often said, "She reminded me that music isn't about showing off. It's about giving a piece of yourself. It's about honesty, vulnerability, and connection. I thought I knew everything, but she taught me something I'll never forget." She would smile quietly when she heard this, not seeking praise, but knowing that her story and her music had found a place in the world. She had turned grief into beauty, loss into meaning, and silence into a voice that could reach thousands. The final concert ended with a standing ovation that lasted for minutes. People cried openly, applauded with tears in their eyes, and whispered to one another about the power of what they had just experienced. Some left in silence, carrying the feeling with them, unsure if they would ever forget it. Others talked about it for weeks, sharing the story of the simple woman whose music reminded them of what truly mattered. After the concert, the woman and the pianist walked out together. They didn't speak much, only smiled at one another. There was no need for words. They both understood the journey they had shared, the lessons learned, and the lives touched. Music had given them a connection that went beyond performance, fame, or recognition. It had given them understanding, humility, and the knowledge that true art comes from living and feeling. Later that night, the woman sat by her window looking at the stars. She thought of her son, of the nights they had shared, and of the journey that had brought her here. She realized that music had been her bridge to him, and now it was a bridge to the world. She had found a voice not for fame but for truth. The pianist, too, reflected on the night. He had learned something he could never teach in a classroom or demonstrate on stage. He had learned that music at its heart is about connection, feeling, and honesty. And he had learned that greatness doesn't always come from skill alone. It comes from courage, from love, from the willingness to share a piece of yourself. In the years that followed, the woman continued to play, quietly changing lives, comforting hearts, and sharing her story through melody. The pianist continued to perform, but now with a depth and humility that audiences could feel. Together they had discovered a truth that could not be measured in applause, awards, or fame, a truth that lived in every note, every pause and every silence between the keys. The story of the woman who had once been laughed at for asking to play grew beyond the concert halls. It inspired others to embrace their passions, to share what they had been hiding, and to find courage in the quietest parts of themselves. People realized that greatness can appear in unexpected places, and that the most extraordinary moments often come from ordinary people. In the end, both the pianist and the woman understood that music was never about competition, perfection, or recognition. It was about life, its joys, its sorrows, its quiet miracles, and its deepest emotions. And for both of them, that understanding had changed everything. The woman never sought to become famous. She didn't crave applause or recognition. Yet in sharing her gift, she had touched countless hearts and reminded the world of something simple but profound. That beauty comes from honesty, strength comes from vulnerability, and the simplest melody, played with love, can change lives forever. The pianist often told his students the story of the woman who had walked into his life quietly, asking to play. He told them how she had reminded him of what music truly meant, and how her courage had inspired everyone who heard her. He spoke not of skill but of heart, not of fame but of feeling. And through his stories, her music continued to inspire others, long after the last note had faded. And so, the simple woman who had once been laughed at, the one who had dared to touch the keys, became a quiet legend, not for her skill, not for her fame, but for the truth she had shared, the hearts she had touched, and the lives she had changed, one note at a time.